America doesn't look to be in a good position now. America seems horribly divided with a broken economic system, massive social tensions, and 30 other problems. Most Americans would say that their country is going downhill. However, the future is always more complicated than the whims of the moment would believe. What is the future of America over the next century? What trends will dominate America over that period? How will the most powerful nation in the world change over the 21st century? That's the question of this video. Hi everybody, I'm Rudyard Lynch, the What If Altist guy, and I remember back when I was hiking the Appalachian Trail a few years back, how I'd walk like 15-20 miles a day, and then I'd just eat so much ramen. I'd have like 5 packs a day because I was so hungry. And right now, being a YouTuber can be a pretty time-consuming job, and there are days where it's hard to choose between eating right and getting something quick. I don't like compromising my diet when possible, but cooking a whole meal also compromises my schedule. Thankfully, I found a great middle ground with Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen makes noodles, obviously, but what makes Vite Ramen so much better than a lot of the competition is that the noodles have a lot of protein inside of them, and also they're very easy to cook, making them much healthier than a lot of other stuff you get. When I'm pressed for time and I need to get a video out, it's easy just to open a pack of Vite Ramen and make something of the recipes available on their website. I get a great meal and I can release these videos. Vite Ramen makes delicious noodles for a good price, so if you're looking for something to cook with the nutrition you want, order Vite Ramen. They have a great selection at an affordable price and they taste really good. Click the link below to get a bundle that gives you free gifts and free shipping in the contiguous US, and don't forget to use my code WhatIfAltist at checkout for additional 10% off. That's viteramen.com/whatifaltist, or just click the link below and use the code WhatIfAltist. As I said before, America seems to be in a stressful position as of now. A majority of Americans at this point think we will have a civil war. The country is a series of endemic problems like inequality, social atomization, polarization, and the like. America, in short, is a very divided country. I don't want to dive into too many of the details about this since I've just made an entire video about it. However, the long and short is that according to a couple different metrics, internal social crises are the norm across history, driven by demographic and economic factors alongside generational and longer-term civilizational patterns, all of which predict America will have an internal crisis over the 2020s. Here's a text wall to explain all of the complications here. The easiest answer is that due to inequality and stagnating wages, people aren't incentivized to work inside the system, instead to try to create new factions to let their subgroup get more power. This is a pattern we've seen across history, whether in the Roman Civil Wars, French Revolution, or Russian Revolution. These events can be predicted by computer models, which predicted all of these crises and more in the years that actually took place by using inequality and income stagnation statistics. Those models in 2010 predicted America would have a civil war in the 2020s. This might sound extreme, but let's view it this way. Just consider how much more immediately extreme the United States has gotten over simply the last 5 to 10 years. Consider Trump, the storming of the Capitol, the BLM riots, social justice's takeover of the dominant cultural institutions, and the like. Then keep in mind that all the metrics line up for the US to have a massive recession over the next few years. If conditions get harder, how much worse will politics get as people get more desperate? Furthermore, is there really any way America can cool down emotionally and politically without the country having a lesson be taught to it in a painful way? People are too worked up at this point to do anything except scream and cry before things get better. In America, this is the divide between the right and the left, or as I've explained in these other videos, really boils down to a conflict between the college-educated and the non-college-educated, both trying to give their faction the most influence, jobs, and power as possible. However, this is all America in the present world. How would a crisis between the right and the left in America play out in the future? Will America actually have a civil war? As this video explains, the complication is that all the variables line up statistically for America to have a civil war. But in real terms, the right has so much more punching power than the left does, and all things that determine which side would win a civil war, whether loyalty of the armed forces, control of resources, food, and territory, militaristic and warlike spirit, appeal to aggressive young men, weapons ownership, centralized geography, and the like, the American right has a clear, powerful advantage over the left. America cannot have a civil war given that one side would just immediately win. This is similar to how there have been other left-wing movements that have tried to gain power and then have been immediately crushed by right-wing militaries in places like Germany, Argentina, Hungary, Brazil, Chile, Spain, Indonesia, and many others. The left, believing they'll have a successful revolution and the public will rise en masse in support of them, rebel only to realize that the countryside and the army still hate them, is a common pattern across history. A variable I've alluded to earlier, and I've covered in more detail in this video, is the coming recession. Literally everything lines up for America, and the whole world by extension, to have a truly massive recession over the next couple years. This is the era of the highest money printing ever in history by a truly massive margin. Recessions happen when the projections for the economy are off from how the economy can actually perform, and when people realize that, the economy crashes as people's expectations cannot match the reality. Our era of history is totally littered with this. In the tech startup space, money is being invested in truly idiotic ways that can never repay the investment. For Christ's sake, just look at crypto, where even things that are joke currencies like Dogecoin made as a parody of crypto that at its height had a net worth of $8 billion. When the economy behaves in stupid ways like this, or how the stock market kept rising when a quarter of America's population was unemployed during COVID, are screaming indicators of an economy about to crash. Considering how much money our government's printing on a truly insane degree, it seems strange to not think inflation would get much worse over the next few years. Something to consider is that young people, or those who agitate in revolutions, civil wars, and are the gears of political change, are already living in not amazing conditions. Inflation is already effectively a tax on the poor, who are hit the hardest, and thus inflation rates would impoverish many already poor. Thus, if the standard of living goes down for young Americans, their only recourse would be towards political radicalism and extremism. The question is how terrible things can get. There are two possible scenarios I see. The first is a peaceful one. The US in this world simply has high political tension, but it never spills over into directly enveloping its political system. In this world, you might see militias or various gangs seize control of cities and skirmish, but the country continues to function on a fundamental level. The second scenario is one in which America has a legitimate civil war. The right and the left come to blows, and as explained before, the right wins. Maybe in some situations the left tries to seize control over major cities and then the right kills the leftist leadership en masse. It might be controversial for me to say this, but I don't see any way the right doesn't win the culture wars. I know I have a certain degree of political bias given my own center-right politics, but I'll explain how I believe the evidence speaks for itself here. Both political sides in America have become more extreme over time. However, for the right, this extremity always moves in the direction of pushing towards group unity, while for the left, it always pushes disunity and division. Right-wing extremism pushes militarism, nationalism, religiosity, a high birth rate, loyalty, authority, and other things that make a group more competitive and unified against outsiders. Meanwhile, the left goes through purity battles of trying to virtue signal their authority over others inside their own group. Look at how with cancel culture, the left targets its own moderates and eats them rather than conservatives. Look at how the social justice left totally shuts down dissenting opinions in the social institutions it controls, like academia, the media, or certain corporations, which the right just does not do. Whenever the left makes a gain, it immediately jumps to something else, making it practically impossible to stay in its good graces. Its ideology is literally that most of its followers are stuck in sin permanently as racist, homophobic, and the like, literally no matter what they do. That's a synopsis of the book White Fragility, which is the biggest social justice text out now. Just compare left versus right-wing institutions. If a company gets taken over by far leftists today, it will immediately structure its entire hiring process, its social media presence, and corporate culture over ever radicalizing left-wing principles. In left-wing controlled cities, there is omnipresent homelessness, drug abuse, no real estate development, which makes rents often unlivable, one can't speak openly on heretical opinions, and taxes and regulations are insane. None of this is true at all in right-wing organizations, which continue to function much as they did before for decades. This has resulted in the gradual shift and now flood of competent, reasonable people to the right. Just look at previous left or centrist figures like Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand, Tim Pool, or Joe Rogan, who have now ended up on the right since they dissent against social justice. Just look at the mass migration that's happening from left-wing to conservative states and cities. One of the things that's difficult for people in the modern left to understand is that they created the alt-right in all effect. Before they showed up, people on the genuine far right were extremely rare, but due to how uncompromising social justice is and how they've taken over the dominant cultural institutions of society, It's resulted in the radicalization of the right, as evidenced in QAnon and the Capitol storming. Another thing to consider is that the more developed a country is, the more likely it is to go towards right-wing radicalism and the left towards the left. This is why countries like Vietnam, China, or Russia went towards communism, while Spain, Germany, or Japan went for fascism. Likewise, why not a single Western Christian country, and especially no Protestant Germanic countries, have ever gone for leftist radicalism. Thus, with the precedent established, America, if it goes in any radical direction, will go right. The norm for civil wars is that the most radical side wins. In the English Civil War, it was the Puritans. In Russia, the Bolsheviks. In France, the Jacobins. Or in the US, the Radical Republicans. This is since after the Civil War, there is in turn a civil war between the winning faction over which faction will rule, and the most fanatical factions are able to consume the less radical ones until only they remain. Also, the degree of how horrible and bloody the Civil War is, and thus how much pressure it exerts upon the population, determines how radical the society gets. Thus, the more peaceful first scenario would result in a less radical rightist America than the latter more violent scenario. What happens in these historic cycles is that one faction of the elite wins, crushes the other, and then creates a unified elite that can lead society forward for the cycle to restart. What kind of America would we end up with after America's political crisis? There are a couple factions in the American right that have the potential to become the new ruling coalition when the dust clears, thus determining the direction of America for decades to come. It largely depends on how bad things get, which in turn determines how desperate the society is and how badly they want unity. The best answer is that in a milder scenario in which the blood never really gets flowing, is that America just elects a right-wing populist leader that's able to guide the country into a new era by bypassing the most radical leftist elements, leaving them in irrelevance as the most left-wing states become future Rust Belts. Ethnic minorities have been voting for conservatives at higher and higher rates over the last couple years, and they tend to view the left's social policies as abominations. Thus, I could see the right scooping up lots of ethnic minorities from an unhinged left that goes into insane social justice. This leader would be a figure of FDR, Lincoln, or George Washington's caliber that would guide America with new policies to get out. As we'll talk about later in this video, America has the best fundamentals in stuff like technology, social will, demographics, and the like of anywhere on the planet, and so has the potential to skip the worst parts of the crisis of the 21st century that will likely envelop the whole world, as I talk about in this video. After this, there are progressively worse scenarios, with the worst, and still pretty probable, being America becomes a military dictatorship and theocracy. The reason I posit this choice fairly highly is that the military is by far the most trusted organization in America by a pretty significant margin. Around 80% of Americans trust the military, while most other social institutions like Congress, the media, or the universities hover at around 20%. The military is multiracial, tilts right but not fanatically so, and is one of America's most competent and meritocratic organizations. The horrifying thing is that America as a military dictatorship would probably function pretty well. There are a couple other things to suggest a military dictatorship. One being that modern America has a tremendous amount of parallels with late Republican Rome, whether the divided political system, the concentration of economic power with staggering inequality into megacorporations, the recent rise to superpower status, the decline in religion, and many other things. What happened in Rome was that every other social institution was rotted through decadence until the only thing that remained functioning was the military, and Rome became effectively a military dictatorship for its final 400 years. The other is that you see very clear patterns of countries repeating their secular cycles over time, the details of which are in this text wall. The last time the English-speaking world has had a severe social and political crisis was with the English Civil War, in which the faction that ended up winning in the end was an arch-conservative group as a Puritan military dictatorial theocracy. An interesting fact is that the American Civil War was in many ways a repeat of the English Civil War, and that the descendants of the parliamentarians settled in the North and the Royalists in the South. An American Oliver Cromwell, or a religiously fanatical army commander, eventually taking over power seems relatively plausible. Which leads us to the next point, of religious fanaticism. There are a couple different factions of the American right. The first I'd posit are business-based libertarians, which are incapable of forming fanatical ideological unity inside of them as a single faction and would thus lose. After that, you have religious conservatives who are unified by their faith and to a lesser degree ethnicity towards group cohesion. After that, you have the alt-right or the nativist racist right, which is definitely a contender, And after that, there is a potential for a centrist right based off a cult figure like Jordan Peterson. When I look at the young right, I see people worshipping the cross, the frog, and the lobster. However, the truth is that you'd probably see an alliance of different kinds of these. Nativism, religion, and militarism often mix together. You see this in military dictatorships in places like Spain, Italy, Japan, Argentina, Chile, or Germany that simultaneously push social conservatism, nationalism, and ethnicity. The army allied with religious fanatics are a perfect combination of capability and fanaticism to seize power. I've outlined the harshest and the best options here. Now let's give some in between. One being that a far-right party gains power democratically, another that the right wins a civil war while remaining democratic and secular, and I see any range of options with the main constants being things will get further to the political right, and from our current perspective, some fairly radical faction of the right will win in the end. I think the chances America stops being a democracy are pretty low in general. America has never not been a democracy, and there is no anti-democratic faction in America. Likewise, as we will talk about later, America has good fundamentals, and no one will ever starve in America due to the sheer amount of food it has, being that shit will never hit the fan as much as it could in other countries or eras of history. Another thing to consider is that even if America does become a military dictatorship, it probably would not stay one for a long period. The precedent for rightist military dictatorships, whether in Poland, Germany, Spain, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, and about 20 others, is that they become liberal democracies after a couple decades. The rightist dictators tend to manage the economy and society well, resulting in the country becoming wealthier and better educated, and then peacefully hand over power to a liberal democracy. The reason there are basically no rightist dictatorships today is they all became peaceful liberal democracies. We even see this with Cromwell's England, where after his death, England reverted back to democracy. The only exception I can see to this is that if America experiences a total moral degeneration, like that which killed the Roman Republic, with total collapse in belief in anything. However, I don't think America has fallen to that level yet, given we don't practice mass slavery of 1/3 our population, regularly assassinate political leaders, demand arbitrary tribute from our allies, or annex them, and about 20 other things. As a person in the right-wing internet space, I'd like to add a couple details to kind of establish a view of what this new ruling class could be. The second is I think it might be overtly racist or nationalistic, but I doubt it would be very much so in actual terms. The greatest irony, and you're probably not going to believe me, but most alt-right circles tend to be fairly racially diverse. The most right-wing people I know are Hispanic and Asian, and alt-right circles tend to have a lot of both. Most alt-right guys have Asian girlfriends, for Christ's sake. The fundamental truth is that America is such a diverse society that being legitimately racist is extremely inconvenient and difficult. Just living your life, you're going to meet so many cool and interesting people of color for true old-time racism to make a revival in America. I think a future alt-right regime would almost certainly be very anti-immigration, and I could see them being cruel or discriminatory towards black people, which America has a long history of evil oppression against, as well as having little presence on the right, while also being the golden child of social justice, which would, of course, breed resentment. However, if you look at the top right-wing platforms like Ben Shapiro's network, PragerU, or Fox News, they all go to great effort of trying to include black people in disproportionate numbers to their population on their networks. I mean, also for another group, look at how many important gay conservative figures there are. So, that's the good news. The bad news is women. One of the worst impressions I've gotten from the new right is that it's fairly sexist. This is partially since social justice has made man-hating socially acceptable, and this tends to target more intelligent women. Young men look for female approval, and thus being told masculinity is inherently toxic and oppressive, while telling young women that they don't need men and men are gross will create a horrible counter-reaction. On top of this, social media and dating apps mean most young men get very little sex, thus creating an agitated and hopeless large class of young men waiting to get radicalized. Historically, when there's a large class of sexless young men, they always cause revolutions or wars. These all add up to conditions that would breed a very sexist movement. A big reason every society ever in human history has been a patriarchy is that, in the most blunt, awful terms, young men are a more dangerous demographic than young women. And so it's inside the self-interest of society to oppress women to men's gain in order to placate them. Likewise, any future leaders of the right looking to convince young men to fight for them could easily pawn off female oppression and controlling women's sex as a powerful chip to motivate their base. I don't think The Handmaid's Tale is likely, but I don't think it's impossible either. The reason that women have been so horribly oppressed over history is they simply can't resist a unified patriarchy, and the patriarchy has every reason to exploit them. Feminism and its man-hating excesses would be used as an excuse for why women didn't deserve rights. The right-wing regime would probably evolve into moderation, as is often the case. As Ibn Khaldun and the other great ancient and medieval historians said, the right-wing regime would probably evolve into moderation, as is normally the case. As Ibn Khaldun and all the other great historians of the pre-modern world said, fanaticism and hardness breeds into temperance, which then falls into decadence and idiocy, which restarts the cycle. Most harsh, right-wing, religious, militaristic regimes evolve into becoming normal societies. As said before, examples of this abound over the 20th century, but you could also look at Puritan New England or England, Maoist China into modern capitalism, or the Stoicism of Rome into decadence. The most normal result is that after a massive social shift, the left pushes for total social change too hard and then gets crushed by the right. The thing is, the total society has changed a lot, so the right ends up adopting a tremendous amount of the social changes the left wanted just since they make more sense in the new world. Examples of this are how the peasant rebellions after the Black Death, the revolutions of 1848, the French Revolution or communism were all crushed, but in winning those conflicts, the right integrated a tremendous amount of the left's platforms. We're in a world in which even if the right wins, it would be hard to move back to oppressing minorities and gay people, who are generally pretty well liked today. Likewise, in an era of less social division, I could see new innovative kinds of welfare develop. This would result in a new America, taking the best aspects of the right and left into a new, strong, unified elite that would be able to lead America into a new age. One of the surprising things that few Americans realize is that their country is still positioning the most powerful country in the world for at least the next century. Many Americans think they'll be surpassed by countries like India or China, but these are like previous contenders such as the Soviets, Japanese, or Germans, who will all be held back by their own internal problems, but look impressive in the short term. I go into much more detail about this in other videos, but China's population will halve by the middle of the century. They're beset by a tremendous amount of issues between a tyrannical, incompetent government, massive class problems, water and food insecurity, and about 25 other things I talk about in these other videos. China will probably have a revolution over the next 5 years, followed by a warring states period that will halve their population over the next 60 years, leaving them out of great power politics until the end of this century. India, meanwhile, is barely a contender. India's development has been strange, with no growth in stuff like agriculture, scarcely an improvement in real standard of living for most people, stagnation in education, and all the growth concentrated in technology and service industries, which is a very strange way to industrialize. India has many of the same issues as China, whether the social pains of industrialization, massive pollution, class problems, etc. However, if you look at India's profile across history, they're not in a position to replace America simply by disposition. Indian armies have never once attacked outside India, and this is a subcontinent which has been invaded something like 21 times and lost 19 of those. India has no equivalent to a powerful state like the Arab Caliphate, Chinese Empire, or Roman Empire in its history, since the culture has always been more powerful than the state. India has as much, if not significantly more cultural diversity than Europe, and is culturally more like a European Union than a country like the US or China. On top of this, India has countless castes that further divide the society in extremely complicated ways. Meanwhile, the US doesn't really have long-term problems as an empire. When people talk about America's failings, they normally point to short-term trends like inequality, current political figures, or the rise of other areas of the world. However, even if the US is doing poorly now, its fundamentals which allow countries to be strong for centuries are still there and strong. I talk about this in this video. Remember, countries often go through the most horrifying crises and still come out on top. Look at how right after the French Revolution came Napoleon's conquests, how Russia reached its empire's largest size after the Russian Revolution, America conquered the West after the Civil War, Britain made the empire after their Civil War, and so forth. Actually, internal struggles tend to presage imperial expansion in golden ages as the new elite becomes unified and energetic from having purged dissenting and weak elements. America's advantages are that it has the youngest population of any developed country, as most of the world will collapse into aging. It's the most technologically inventive society in the world. It still has a lot of national will and pride. It's one of the world's most religious countries in the developed world, which comes with a lot of good side effects. Its internal geography means it cannot be threatened. It is the largest economy in the world, which is almost entirely self-sufficient in almost any resource, and can be easily so for manufacturing. The US is an exporter, let alone self-sufficient in almost any material that's necessary, whether food, oil, iron, and so forth. Something a lot of people don't realize is the US has actually remained a stable quarter of the world's economy since the 1960s, and hasn't in fact been losing economic ground to the rest of the world. It has extremely functional institutions and a federal system that prevents centralized leadership from destroying the society. Peter Zeihan's books do a great job showing how in the coming decades, and once America unifies as a society, it's positioned to have a golden age. If we look at the Strauss or Turton cycles, America will be going through its next golden age, similar to the 1950s post-war period sometime around the middle of the century, with a good bet on the 2060s. In this section, I will go through both the internal, social, and external effects of what this new America will be. Imagine being a person in the year 1900 hearing about the culture of the 1970s. You'd hear about how white people listened to black music regularly, how scantily clad girls would dance at public sporting events, how youths would own their own cars and would have a whole part of their lives dedicated to not working but to leisure, how popular musicians were worshipped as gods, and other things that would completely shock you. Although I cannot possibly predict the future of culture in its totality, I'd like to use this as a frame of reference for what the future of culture could look like, since it's almost certainly going to change as much as it did in that era. There are a couple patterns in American history to tease out. The first is that America under Trump did exactly what you'd predict it would, that it shut off immigration, as America has done twice so before when it reached 20% foreign-born. The Biden administration allowing immigration is happening for contrarian reasons, but basically America will likely follow the pattern it has before, in which it cuts off immigration at that number, since that's where it depresses wages to beyond a degree that the American working class are willing to accept. In both times before, in 1790 to 1850 and from 1920 to 1980, came a 60-year period of little immigration in which the U.S. assimilates the recent immigrant populations. This will happen in America over the 21st century, as the recent wave of Asian and Hispanic Americans assimilates into modern American culture. Already, 40% of Hispanics and Asians marry out of their race every generation, mostly into the broader white population. Both groups have assimilated at very rapid speeds, with Hispanics even along the Mexican border, where they are the vast majority identifying as Americans and only speaking English. After a couple generations, both of these groups would probably merge into the broader white American population. Your average Hispanic American is 2/3 European ancestry already and identifies as white of Spanish ancestry, while Asian Americans are only 5% of the population and have the lowest birth rate. And so if America doesn't have another wave of Asian immigration, which seems plausible given Asia's population will collapse over the next few decades, Asian Americans won't exist in any real size by the end of this century, having totally blended in with the white population. Black Americans, meanwhile, have remained an entrenched caste for all of American history, gaining massive amounts of cultural power recently, outbreeding at much lower rates, and will almost certainly maintain their cultural difference. The definition of white American has been continually expanded over American history, meaning originally only the British and the Dutch, then expanding to Germans, French, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and more. This will likely be expanded to include many Hispanics and mixed-race people, which is what has happened in Latin American countries. What has happened after each phase of shutting down immigration has been the rise in new strong American nationalism, as was the case in the early 19th century and in the post-war 20th century. America will go through a patriotic era in this new period as well. The American economy will go through a new phase as well. This will be partially driven by the secular crisis, which will result in wages going up through ending immigration, killing off parts of the elite and social unity. However, due to East Asia's population collapse, industry will move back to America, thus establishing good-paying industrial jobs. If we've had a society where America shut off immigration, America is reindustrialized, and sadly one in which women are more oppressed, you would shrink the labor market markedly, thus resulting in a large growth in wages similar to the post-World War II period. You've seen large amounts of productivity growth already, it's been eaten up by growth in the labor market. This is similar to the World War era, where various political and demographic factors kept wages artificially low, which after the war resulted in massive wage growth once those problems were removed. This economic growth will be concentrated in certain areas and sectors, just like in previous eras in American history. Across American history, we've seen cultural dominance by 4 different groups, with the last being the coastal, college-educated technocrats since the World War era. However, this group has grown decadent and dumb, which will result in another part of the country becoming dominant and another social class gaining predominance. This is similar to how New England, the antebellum South, and the Rust Belt have already seen their social classes defeated and replaced by other groups, while influence moves to elsewhere in America. We're already seeing this trend today, and people are moving out of zealous, expensive, over-regulated coastal blue states, and the new center of America seems to be around the Gulf of Mexico in the South. Cities like Houston, Miami, Austin, and the like will become new American hubs. Arizona also shares many similar characteristics and will likely be a winner. The new centers in America are developing in especially Florida and Texas, with secondary ones being in Georgia and Tennessee. The thing that holds this region back is its poor education, which will likely continue to prevent it from achieving total dominance, however. Other areas that will benefit will be the mountain states, which with remote work will get an influx of immigrants who will want to live in one of the most beautiful places in the world. I could also see certain Midwestern or middle states able to benefit from the weakening Northeast. Ohio and Pennsylvania being logical winners if New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Massachusetts, and other states become too anti-business as they are gradually becoming. Likewise, the states like Wisconsin, Iowa, or Illinois have done very well from America's reindustrialization due to good education, good geography, central location, and hard-working populations. If the social class that's currently discrediting itself is the college-educated technocrats, its replacement seems to be those that are able to use the internet most effectively, or hype lords able to channel power on the internet, or those who are powerful in technology. The people who can manage social media will be able to influence society in powerful ways. I can already see this transformation in action, and at the expense of sounding like a total egomaniac. I have a larger platform to talk about history than almost any history professor, except I'm a 21-year-old with absolutely no credentials. The fact that people are willing to listen to me at all shows a great distrust of traditional technocratic system, as well as the internet's raw power. With this new digital elite, you'd expect people of high talent to rise from the internet through its raw merit in the beginning, but over the next few generations, as that system decays, you would expect complete fools and idiots to rise since the internet is no filtering mechanism for intelligence or moral quality, merely popularity. As I talk about in this video, the internet will wildly affect multiple elements in American society. One will be ruralization, as people will move to cheap and more pleasant rural areas as they can work remotely. The other being a gig-based economy rather than large corporations, as the internet allows mass coordination which otherwise would not be possible, that allows bypassing the inflexible corporate structures. Most of America's cultural institutions are decayed. Hollywood and the music industry have been eaten by their age and corruption and making nothing of quality. The music industry puts out mumble rappers who can't rhyme or make a beat or manufacture Disney pop star number 12. Meanwhile, the film industry puts out the 36 Alien vs. Predator movie. The sad thing is that quality does exist out there. I'm obsessed with pop music, for example, and it's so depressing to hear great pop artists like Maisie Peters, M. Byhold, Lindsey Sterling, or Bastille not break through while much worse artists get chosen by the studios. A lot of the best artists come through the internet, but the entrenched industries and also the bad taste of a decayed and perverse society prevents good music from getting to the top. The reason that the post-war period had such incredible music is that it was a new cultural blank slate after the world wars, and the post-conflict era here will be similar, producing whole new incredible kinds of art. Throw in what new technologies like virtual reality could allow, and we could see a massive, beautiful artistic period. America is a very lonely country today, and one without meaning or soul. Sheer nihilism and lack of belief that life matters at all, alongside significant mental health issues, are now often the norm among young people. I talk about this more in this video. You know what would solve these problems? A religious revival, which would bring community together while creating meaning. The United States has religious revivals every century in the 40s decade, whether the First Great Awakening in the 70s and 40s, the Second Great Awakening in the 1840s, or the post-war religious boom of the 1940s and 50s. This probably happens for generational reasons. Likewise, religious revivals almost always come after periods of struggle and fear of death, and the internet would in effect precipitate the mass rise of religious figures through easier communication, kind of like the rise of the Axial Age. Lots of people say that modern society is beyond religion as society is too secular. However, the data shows the decline in belief in God has been pretty small by most accounts, with 90% of Americans believing in God and the vast majority of Americans praying regularly. In fact, your average American agnostic is more religious in belief in God and amount of time spent praying than your average European religious person. It's just that Americans are unhappy with the modern religious structure. My best guess would be this religious revival in the 2040s would combine Jordan Peterson's philosophy, which explains Christian morality in secular terms, with Pentecostalism, an extremely popular branch of Christianity in the Third World, in which people work themselves into a frenzy or take drugs to hear God talk through them in tongues. I'm also guessing and taking some other elements from, let's say, New Age or other, let's say, Eastern philosophies. My guess is that the children of the Zoomers, tired of their parents' loneliness and nihilism, would fall in love with a religion that creates communities and allows them to bear their hearts out. As I've said in other videos, the loneliness of the internet world will provoke a very extroverted and social response in the next generation. The top predictive factors for population growth are religiosity, ruralization, and good wages, all of which will exist, meaning the US will have a large baby boom in the middle of the century. This might sound doubtful, but you have to keep in mind the average age of marriage before World War II was 28. Meanwhile, the average age of marriage is 32 today. This means that we could see a radical shift in the future towards more family natal norms. On top of this are the Kondratiev cycles, which predict technological revolutions and recessions over the last 200 years. They progress by a new kind of technology being discovered, which then results in economic growth, which afterwards results in a recession, and the record is held very well for the last 200 years. This would mean that the US would also likely experience a technological revolution around the mid-century, which would result in further economic growth. I have no idea what this could be, though. I think biotech's a good bet, with space, AI, and a couple others being options. I'm purposely not talking about American foreign policy here or the future of the American empire, given that will be a video in of itself, but I should bring up that for a series of complicated reasons I explained in this video, it seems fairly plausible the US annexes part of Canada over the next century. In short, Canada's demographic and political structure has set it up to have serious issues in the middle of this century that make the US look appealing to the middle part of Canada. The other being space, in which the US is perfectly positioned to colonize space. The US has the frontier spirit, the technological ability, the capital, and the population to colonize space. The colonization of space is an almost religious position for many Americans, especially in technology, who view it as the extension of their frontier. Space technology will also likely go through a technological revolution over the next few decades, and I was talking to one of the biggest experts in the field about this, and he thinks that the cost of space technology will go down by 99% over the next couple decades. I think the US has such an advantage as to effectively keep much of the solar system on lock as American colonies in the middle of this century and this American golden age. The goods from space and the power from controlling space would in turn give the US even more of an advantage, with a monopoly on many raw materials, dominance over other militaries through space weapons, and the ability to settle ethnic Americans in space, creating new Americas. In effect, the Americans will be able to replicate the advantages Britain accrued from its navy and ability to colonize the world. This picture of America's future in the middle and late parts of the 21st century might look overly rosy, but I genuinely believe it. For the reasons I outlined before, I think the US is in a very good position over the next century. Just as a brief reference, let's look at the mid-centuries of the last couple centuries in the Anglo-Saxon world. The 20th century was one of immense growth of all kinds in the US. The middle and end of the 19th century was one of unbridled growth and success of every possible kind in both Britain and the US. The 18th century saw America and the British Empire's formation. In recent history, if you were to bet on any single area of the world for the last couple centuries, at the expense of sounding arrogant, the English-speaking world would be your best bet for every single century. What if felt distant? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Alternatively, check out my social media with the links to my Instagram, Twitter, and the like in the description, as well as my Pearl Pillar and Patreon. As always, thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.